Adriana is a principal legislative analyst in the University of California Office of Federal Government Relations, where she serves as an advocate for UC with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. Prior to this position, Adriana was a policy and advocacy fellow at the Society for Neuroscience, where she provided staff support for special and ongoing projects, including SFN's annual lobby event and the Society's annual meeting. In addition to working at UC, Adriana also serves as Policy Task Force co-leader on the board of directors at Future of Research and is Chief Outreach Officer at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. She obtained her PhD in biochemistry, cell and developmental biology from Emory, and a bachelor's in biological sciences from Clemson University. So, Adriana?
So I'll be telling you a little bit about neuroscience, mostly from my experience at SFN, also talking about scientific societies in this ecosystem that we've been hearing about today, and coming from my background, as Ben said, from what academics can do to influence science policy. So in the context of this module, ways that you can think of defining science policy, which we've heard of before, but just wanted to find out three different things here. One is funding, allocation of resources. Number two is careers of scientists, obviously how we're training them in both science and policy, and translation of scientific discoveries into technological innovation. And this is obviously very applicable to neuroscience as well as other fields that you've heard about today. And as Kay and others have mentioned, when you think about science policy as an academic, it's more likely that you would say you're doing science for policy, where you use scientific findings to develop public policy. The other way being policy for science, where government laws, regulations, and policies affect the practice of science. And so while you might be thinking that as academics influence policy through evidence-based science, it's really more of a bidirectional arrow in that science influences policy and policy influences the way science is done. So just to sort of keep this in mind as we move along today and throughout the course. So we've heard also from Kay, and you've seen other groups here in terms of crafting evidence-based policy for specific areas. So just wanted to give a little background before I go into neuroscience, because I think this applies to a lot of areas that were discussed here today. So in order for policies to be evidence-based, they must be using empirical and scientific approaches. They must utilize the best available research, as well as provide opportunities to identify what works and highlight gaps. So I sort of see this as a balanced way of thinking about policies that are not necessarily sort of on one side, but really thinking about both pros and cons of the policy that you're developing and what is likely to work and what the gaps are that you're trying to fill. And improving people's lives, so this is sort of one of the ultimate goals that you think about. If you can develop a policy that would really influence society and actually help somebody, that's even better. So here in this quadrant, I'm showing sort of three different goals of evidence-based policy that are from this really nice resource here about effective governments. So one refers to spending specifically. So this, you can think of this as essentially evidence informing budget choices, as well as eliminating inefficient programs and policies. So really where you're investing your money needs to pay off. As well as expanding into innovative programs. And again, policies, what are the policies that you're developing? What are they bringing to what already exists? Are they being evaluated in a empirical manner? And do they strengthen accountability in terms of both data and also programs that are holding governments accountable? So you've already heard about this today in terms of how you can influence policymaking as an early career scientist. And as Kay and also others have alluded to, policymakers work for you, and they're really interested in hearing from what you have to say to inform their decision-making on budgets and policies. And so you can have a really strong influence in informing the decisions that they're making. And researchers can take measures to increase the policy impact of their work by establishing strong relationships with elected officials. So this has come up several times already in terms of creating champions for specific issues. And this idea of collaboration also, so I think a lot of times when you're advocating for a specific issue, it helps to engage the policymakers early to sort of collaborate on a policy or have your input in that as opposed to sort of at the end or just the beginning. I think this is a important concept in terms of establishing relationships and then maintaining them as you're developing your advocacy and as well as policy system. So as a scientist, I think, again, this has come up before, it's important to provide both clear and concise summaries of scientific evidence. And so hopefully we'll teach you some of this in the course as far as how do you pitch, how do you write in a very concise manner for a policymaker who doesn't have time to read and will not read long papers. And this idea of finding allies who are already champions of the issue that you're targeting is sort of a dual way to think about this. Is you want to develop new champions, but you also want to maintain the relationships with the existing ones and build those relationships over time, as well as local engagement, which we'll talk about later in terms of targeting local districts. And again, they listen to constituents who are local. Okay, so moving a little bit into neuroscience, although these principles really apply to a lot of the scientific areas that we're discussing here. In terms of funding, going back to the three areas that I mentioned in the beginning, funding, training, and innovative research. In terms of funding, so obviously the BRAIN initiative is a large initiative that has been developed a few years ago that SFN also responded to. So now kind of shifting into my experience with SFN and how that ties in here. And responding from the society to requests for information from NIH. And so that's one way to advocate on behalf of a society, as well as within a society as a member, to really make your voice heard in responding to the NIH BRAIN initiative request when they were looking to improve it in a number of ways. As has been alluded to here today, telling your personal story is really important. And actually SFN has a really nice series of videos around advocacy as a young scientist, which are really good. And this is one of the tips that telling the story that you're coming with is really important when you advocate. And there are a lot of different resources that argue that in person is better versus letter writing, phone calls, or op-eds. And so there are different ways to engage depending on the time. And also, again, they may have different levels of effectiveness. And some specific things that you might ask for. So now if you've developed champions and sort of advocated for neuroscience, you might say, come visit my lab, really making sure that they can see where their money goes, essentially what they're funding, what the SFN members are doing. And as well as SFN, I know, is very keen on engaging staffers at the annual meeting, which is a really large gathering of neuroscientists, again, to bring them to posters of grad students to talk about just their research and again, see sort of this broader impact. And I think it'll be really important in this advocacy, obviously, to just explain that you are a constituent, being concise in connecting your research to the BRAIN research that's going on more generally, as well as to how this is going to affect both people and society overall. So again, this broader vision that I think is not necessarily being taught as in academia, but hopefully we'll kind of teach you some of that here. And obviously preparing, which really means you need to understand what the needs of the policymakers are and how you can help them and work together with them in crafting policy. So in neuroscience specifically, I think it's both a really exciting field and really challenging for a lot of reasons. One is that it does have large societal value, and I think this is something that a lot of people agree that neuroscience is important, that we need to understand brain function, and funding goes to that. And so in some sense, it is a maybe easier ask of advocating for neuroscience than maybe other fields would be. However, there are also issues to consider that I'll go into just a little bit. And again, here thinking more broadly about how this advocacy extends beyond just the research. And so I'm showing you a couple of courses here from SFN. One is around neuroprosthetics and brain-machine interfaces. So this is really, I think extends to what is possible in neuroscience, as well as quantifying behavior as a lens into the brain. And so this is, again, another kind of research. How do you do this type of work? But as you might imagine, brings up issues related to imaging someone's brain and what that looks like, what it means overall, as well as thinking about innovation. So this is just one paper that I pulled from Brain Facts, which is sort of their outreach side of SFN, trying to engage the public and just say that, this was one paper showing that this particular method reverses neurodegeneration in mice. Again, just trying to point to the fact that these sorts of things are possible potentially in humans, and this is why we advocate for this kind of work. So as I alluded to, I think one of the issues in neuroscience research is ethics. We could have another hour conversation just about this topic. But in terms of a lot of research focuses on imaging, which is very informative in terms of, you want to have high resolution, you want to have high clarity, and can really impact, I think, research and patient care in this field. And however, on the other hand, there are issues related to cognitive enhancement. For example, this idea of neural modification. If you want to improve brain function, what does that mean? What ethical issues are associated with that, as well as consent capacity, which is a large discussion in terms of, for example, Alzheimer's patients that don't have consent capacity, and how do you deal with that in the research field specifically. So this is just to give you a flavor of issues that you might be thinking about when you're working in neuroscience or advocating for this kind of work, that these issues might be coming up. So in the last slide, so I've sort of talked to you about thinking about this as coming from an academic perspective when you're advocating to policymakers, but really, as I've alluded to talking about SFN here, and also AAAS and other societies, scientific societies have a really strong role in advocacy because they can broadly promote advancement of science in society, again, going broadly from the research to society. They can advocate as a whole as an organization, as well as promoting advocacy among their members, and there are different ways this can happen. They're also considered objective sources of technical expertise, which is helpful, as well as guardians of the proper use of knowledge by society. So this gives credibility to societies in that, again, they will be looking to use evidence-based research to influence society, and that's a credible resource. And finally, community outreach. So this is something that SFN is really good at in terms of, and you might imagine this is attractive to students who want to learn research, or just want to go to a museum and hold a brain or something like that. It's I think it's a very tangible way to reach the public through neuroscience, which might extend also to art. So there's a lot of intersection between neuroscience and art in terms of engaging the public. Economics, when you think about, for example, what influences decision-making in terms of economics, how much money you spend on things, and technology, which I've alluded to in terms of the brain-machine interface and other things. So there's a lot of potential here for neuroscience, as well as for scientific societies to engage the public and policymakers through all these different ways. And so to just sort of advocating for engaging with scientific societies, because it's a great way to get started in policy and advocacy. So that's all I have. This is my contact information. Happy to chat more, and I'm also on Twitter.